Some folks say a broken heart never heals. But what if it's not about healing, but about finding someone who's willing to see you for what you truly are? Eliza Hart had heard those words, or something like them, whispered to her in hushed tones throughout her life. She had been left behind, forgotten, rejected, not once, but twice. She had been sent to this place, a small, dusty depot on the edge of nowhere, just as broken as the name that clung to her, the unwanted bride. She wasn't the youngest, the prettiest, or the one everyone thought would be chosen. No, Eliza was the one they didn't even bother to glance at. Her dress was simple, a bit worn, and the hands that gripped the hem were rough from years of hard work. Her eyes, however, remained steady, not pleading, not begging. She knew better than to show her vulnerability. As the crowd of hopeful women shifted, anxiously awaiting their fates, Eliza stood still, her gaze focused on the distant horizon, willing herself not to let the sting of their silence break her. One by one, the other women were picked, their futures decided with a glance or a handshake. They were younger, more polished, more fitting for the image of a bride that men seemed to want. Eliza felt the weight of their stares, their judgment. They were too kind to speak it, but she knew what they thought. She was damaged, discarded, not worthy of a man's love. Yet, she stood there, unmoving, despite the whispers that circled like vultures. When the last of the women were chosen, Eliza was the only one left. The silence was deafening. A strange sense of calm washed over her. She wasn't surprised. She had always been the one left behind. The man overseeing the selections shuffled his papers, his face flushed with discomfort. "Well, seems there's no one left for you," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. She could feel the weight of his pity, but she didn't flinch. Then, just as the room seemed to breathe a sigh of relief at the end of the ordeal, the door creaked open. Footsteps echoed through the room, steady and purposeful. Eliza turned her head slightly, her breath catching in her chest. The man who entered wasn't like the others. He wasn't old or young, handsome or unremarkable. He was something in between. Caleb Boone, a rancher, tall and solid, his boots kicking up dust as he stepped forward. He didn't look at her with pity, nor with judgment. He didn't even seem to notice the stares that followed him as he walked past the crowd of hopeful brides. His eyes, cold and piercing, settled on her hands. He studied her, not with disdain, but with quiet curiosity. He didn't see a broken woman, not in the way others did. "Her," he said, his voice rough, yet steady. The room fell into a stunned silence. No one had expected this. The man who had been expected to choose a young, vibrant woman had instead chosen her, the woman they had all written off. Caleb Boone didn't smile, didn't give her any grand promises. He simply turned and walked toward the door. Without a word, Eliza followed him, her heart racing. What had just happened? Why had he chosen her? She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't even tried. All she had done was stand there, unbroken by the judgment of the world around her. And yet, he had chosen her. For the first time in a long time, Eliza allowed herself to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, this could be the start of something different. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The only sounds were the soft creak of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves against the dusty road. Eliza kept her eyes straight ahead, trying not to think too much about what had just happened. She had been chosen. Caleb Boone had chosen her. But what did that really mean? She wasn't sure. There had been no grand speeches, no promises, just a simple word. Her. The way he said it made her wonder if he had seen something in her that others hadn't, or maybe he simply hadn't cared enough to notice the things everyone else had. As they approached the ranch, the sight of the land stretched out before her. It was vast, with acres of dry, cracked earth and the small cluster of buildings that made up the Boone homestead. The house stood alone in the distance, a weathered structure, its windows dark against the setting sun. Eliza felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had never been one to dream of a grand home, but the idea of stepping into a place like this, all alone, was something she hadn't anticipated. The wagon slowed to a stop in front of the house, and Caleb jumped down from the wagon without a word, walking around to her side to offer his hand. Eliza hesitated for a moment before taking it, feeling the calluses on his palm. He didn't say anything, but his grip was firm, steady. "This is it," he said, motioning toward the house. "Make yourself at home." His words felt strangely final, like an invitation she couldn't refuse, even if she had wanted to. She followed him inside, her boots clicking softly against the wooden floorboards. The house was simple, but it was warm in its own way. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a flickering glow on the stone walls. The smell of fresh bread and stew lingered in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Eliza felt a sense of belonging. Caleb didn't seem to care about the silence that stretched between them. He didn't rush to fill it with empty words or false pleasantries. He simply started a fire in the stove and set about preparing something to eat. Eliza stood at the door, watching him for a moment. He didn't look at her as he worked, but his movements were efficient, practiced. She had the feeling that Caleb Boone wasn't a man who spoke much, but when he did, it was with purpose. She wasn't sure how to start, how to bridge the gap between them. She had never been good at this, at reaching out to others. But she had a feeling that Caleb wasn't looking for small talk. After a few minutes, he glanced up, catching her eye for the first time since they had arrived. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice low and rough, but not unkind. Eliza nodded, unsure of what to say. She hadn't been hungry in days, not really. But the scent of food made her stomach twist. "Sit." He motioned to the small table near the fire. She did as he asked, taking a seat at the table. Caleb set a plate of stew in front of her, along with a slice of cornbread. For a moment, they simply sat there, eating in silence. It was strange, this quiet, this feeling of being accepted without question. Eliza had never known a moment like this, a moment where she didn't have to prove herself, didn't have to explain. Caleb didn't speak much, but his actions said more than words ever could. He handed her a spoon when hers slipped from her grasp, his eyes softening just slightly as he did. Eliza glanced up at him, and for the first time, she saw something other than the rough, hardened exterior of a cowboy. She saw a man who had been through his own battles, his own losses. A man who might understand what it meant to be broken in his own way. They ate in silence, the fire crackling beside them. Eliza felt the weight of the past few days lifting off her shoulders, just a little. She wasn't sure what had brought Caleb Boone to choose her, but as she sat at his table, eating a meal he had prepared, she realized that for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. The days that followed were a strange mix of quiet acceptance and the growing realization that Caleb Boone's world was not going to change overnight. Eliza had expected to feel out of place, to be reminded of her past at every turn, but instead, she found herself settling into a routine. The mornings were cold, and the chill in the air never quite left the house, but the warmth of the fire at night made the small space feel like home. Caleb rarely spoke, but when he did, it was to ask if she needed anything or to offer a quiet comment about the weather. His voice was low, often a little rough, as if he was holding something back. Eliza didn't push him for answers, nor did she question his silences. She had learned long ago that some things were better left unsaid. As the days turned into weeks, Eliza became part of the rhythm of the ranch. She worked alongside Caleb, mending fences, tending to the small garden behind the house, and learning the ins and outs of ranch life. The work was hard, but it was honest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was contributing to something. Caleb, for his part, kept to himself mostly. He worked the land with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen more than his fair share of hardship. He didn't talk much about his past, and Eliza didn't ask. She knew that there were wounds he carried, just as she carried her own. One evening, after a long day of work, Eliza sat outside, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. Caleb was at the well, drawing water, his movements deliberate, as if he was lost in thought. She had grown used to the silence between them, but tonight, it felt different. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air, something neither of them had dared to ask. Eliza stood up slowly, wiping the dust from her hands. She walked toward him, her boots making soft impressions in the dirt. "You don't talk much about why you're here," she said, her voice steady but soft. Caleb didn't look up at first, but when he did, his eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. For a moment, the air between them seemed to hum with the weight of their unspoken histories. He let out a quiet sigh, one that seemed to carry years of unspoken burdens. "I came here to get away from things," he said simply. His voice was rough, but there was no bitterness in it, only weariness. "From people, from expectations. I thought I could find peace here." Eliza nodded slowly, not sure how to respond. She understood the need to run, to escape from the weight of the past. She had done it herself, after all. The silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people, both broken in their own ways, begin to understand each other without needing to speak. Caleb turned back to the well, his hands still working the handle, but his movements were slower now, as if he had allowed himself to be seen, even if only for a moment. Eliza watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to the house. She wasn't sure what she was looking for here, or what Caleb had been looking for when he chose her. But she was beginning to think that maybe they both found something they didn't know they needed. As she entered the house, she could hear the soft crackling of the fire, the comforting warmth that filled the small space. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and for the first time in a long while, Eliza didn't feel so alone. She could hear Caleb's footsteps behind her, his presence steady and familiar. He didn't say anything, but she didn't need him to. They were learning, slowly but surely, how to be with each other, how to find a sense of belonging in a world that had never quite been kind to either of them. The days grew longer as summer stretched across the land, and Eliza began to understand the rhythm of life at the ranch. Caleb, though still quiet and reserved, had a way of working alongside her that felt like an unspoken agreement. He didn't ask much of her, nor did she ask anything of him. They simply worked together, moving through their days in a shared silence that was oddly comforting. The mornings were the hardest, the chill of the air still clinging to the earth as the sun began to rise. Caleb would already be up, working the horses or repairing the fences, while Eliza made breakfast, her hands busy with tasks that felt familiar but new. The scent of fresh bread in the oven filled the small house, and Eliza found herself looking forward to the routine of it all. She had never imagined a life like this, simple, steady, and quiet. But there was something about it that felt like a balm for her soul. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Caleb walked over to the well, his shoulders tense with the weight of the day's work. Eliza watched him from the porch, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the land. She had learned that there was more to Caleb than the silent, stoic man she had met when she arrived. There were moments, small ones, where his guard seemed to drop, and she saw a different side of him. The way his eyes softened when he looked at the land, the way his shoulders would ease after a long day's work. It was as though he carried a burden that he didn't speak about, a weight he had been holding for years. Eliza didn't push him to talk, but she couldn't help but wonder what it was. She didn't want to force him to share his past, but she hoped that, in time, he might trust her enough to let her in. She stood up from the porch and walked toward the well, her footsteps light on the dusty earth. Caleb didn't hear her approach until she was standing beside him. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes when he saw her standing there. "You all right?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence between them. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He glanced at her for a moment, then turned back to the well, his fingers brushing against the worn handle as he pumped water into the bucket. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice low. "Just thinking." Eliza nodded, not pressing him for more. She knew better than to push him when he was like this. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand as she took the bucket from him. He looked at her, startled for a moment, but then he seemed to relax, as though the simple gesture had broken some invisible tension between them. "You don't have to do everything yourself," she said, her voice steady. Caleb met her gaze, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that Eliza couldn't quite place. It wasn't just weariness or indifference, it was something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. He didn't say anything at first, but then he nodded slowly. "I know," he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been in days. They stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken words between them, before Caleb finally turned away and began walking back toward the house. Eliza followed him, the silence between them comfortable, like an old friendship that had been forged through shared hardship. The days that followed were much the same as the ones before, quiet, steady, and filled with the simple work of living. But something had shifted between them. Caleb didn't talk more than he had before, but there was a new warmth in his presence, a subtle shift that Eliza could feel whenever he was near. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could both heal here, on this quiet piece of land. She had come to the ranch looking for a fresh start, and though she hadn't expected it to happen this way, she was beginning to realize that this was the life she had been searching for. Not a grand, sweeping romance, but a slow, steady peace. And in that peace, she had begun to find herself again. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet rhythm of the ranch continued. Caleb had become more than just a man she worked alongside. He had become a presence in her life, solid and steady, like the land they worked. Eliza had grown accustomed to the simplicity of their routine, the early mornings when the sun barely kissed the earth, and the evenings spent in the soft glow of the fire. There was comfort in the silence they shared, a peace that settled in her heart, even when the past lingered like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. One morning, as Eliza tended to the garden, she saw Caleb in the distance, standing by the barn, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the horizon. She paused, her hands resting on the handle of the hoe, watching him for a moment. There was a weight in the way he stood, something that hadn't been there before. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that whatever it was, it had been there for a long time. Caleb didn't often speak of his past, and Eliza had never pushed him to. She had learned that some things were too heavy to be shared too soon. But the more time they spent together, the more she began to feel that there were pieces of him that he kept hidden, tucked away behind that quiet exterior. She wanted to know him, to understand him, but she also understood that trust had to be earned. Caleb had opened up to her in small ways, helping her with the heavier tasks, fixing things around the house, but the real parts of him, the ones that carried the most weight, he kept guarded. Eliza wasn't sure if he would ever talk about it, but as she watched him now, she felt the urge to ask. She set the hoe down and walked toward him, her boots making soft impressions in the dirt. When she reached him, she didn't speak right away. Instead, she stood beside him, her eyes following his gaze to the distant hills. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice gentle, as though the question had been hanging in the air for a while. Caleb didn't immediately answer. He took a slow breath, his hand resting on the top of the fence post. "Just thinking about how much this place has changed," he said, his voice low. "And how much it hasn't." Eliza tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "What do you mean?" Caleb's gaze shifted to her then, his eyes meeting hers with a rare vulnerability. "I thought this place would give me peace," he continued. "But peace, it's a hard thing to find when you're running from something." Eliza felt a pang in her chest. She knew what it was like to run, to try to outrun the past. She had been doing it for years, ever since the life she had known fell apart. But now, standing here with Caleb, she realized that maybe it was time for both of them to stop running. "You don't have to run anymore," she said softly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. Caleb flinched slightly at the contact, but didn't pull away. His eyes softened, and for the first time, Eliza saw the weight of the past in them. The pain, the regret, the things he had never spoken of. They stood there for a long moment, the world around them silent, as if giving them both a moment to breathe. Finally, Caleb spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "I thought coming here would fix everything. But sometimes, you can't outrun your past, no matter how far you go." Eliza didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't have the answers, but she knew that they didn't have to face the past alone. Maybe, just maybe, they could both find a way to heal here, together. She gave his arm a gentle squeeze before stepping back. "I don't think you need to fix anything," she said quietly. "Sometimes, it's enough to just be. To be here." Caleb's lips twitched, a hint of a smile breaking through the stoic mask he wore. "Maybe you're right." Eliza smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. She had come to this ranch hoping for a fresh start, but what she hadn't expected was to find someone who might understand her in ways no one else ever had. The silence between them was different now, softer, more comfortable. And for the first time in a long time, Eliza felt like maybe she was finally where she was meant to be. The days continued to pass with a calm steadiness that Eliza had come to appreciate. The work on the ranch never seemed to end, but neither did the quiet peace that had settled over her heart. She woke each morning to the sound of birds calling from the trees, the sun slowly rising over the distant hills, casting a soft golden light across the land. Caleb was already up, as always, working with the horses or checking the fences. He had become a part of her mornings, though they didn't speak much. His presence was steady, like the earth beneath her feet, and it was in that silence that Eliza began to find something she hadn't even known she was looking for. There was no rush, no pressure to be anything but what she was. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe. It was a quiet kind of healing, the kind that came without fanfare. Caleb's movements, as quiet and steady as the land he worked, were a comfort. She noticed the small things, the way his hands moved when he worked, the small frown that appeared on his face when something wasn't right. He wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way he helped her when she struggled with a task, the way he made sure the fire was always lit when the evenings turned cold, the way he stayed by her side without needing to say a word. It wasn't love, not yet. But there was something between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Eliza found herself growing more comfortable in his presence, allowing herself to trust the quiet moments they shared. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat outside together, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, the sky a deep shade of purple as the stars began to appear. Caleb was leaning against the porch post, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze distant as he stared out at the land. Eliza watched him for a moment, the silence between them filling the space with a quiet intimacy. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost as if she were testing the waters. Caleb didn't immediately respond, his gaze still fixed on the land in front of him. For a moment, Eliza wondered if he had even heard her, but then he turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "Leaving," he repeated, as if the idea hadn't occurred to him in a long time. "I've thought about it, sure. But I've learned something out here." His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness in it, something that spoke of years of silence, years of running from something. "What's that?" Eliza asked softly, her heart beating a little faster. Caleb's gaze softened, and for the first time, Eliza saw something that reminded her of the man who had chosen her that day at the depot, the man who had quietly accepted her, just as she was. "That sometimes staying is harder than leaving," he said, his voice low. "It's easy to run, to leave behind the things that hurt, but it takes something more to stay, to face it." Eliza didn't know what to say to that. She had run from her own past, too, leaving behind everything she had known in the hope of finding something better. But what Caleb said made sense. Leaving was easy, but staying required facing the things you had buried deep inside. She didn't know if she was ready for that, but she knew that here, with Caleb, maybe it wouldn't be so hard. She didn't have to face it alone. "You don't have to face it alone, Caleb," she said softly, her voice steady with a quiet strength that surprised even herself. Caleb looked at her then, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. There was no grand declaration, no sudden shift, but in that moment, something passed between them. Something that spoke of understanding, of trust, of two people learning how to stay, even when the past threatened to pull them away. Caleb didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. His gaze lingered on hers for a moment longer before he turned his attention back to the horizon. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a silence that spoke of quiet understanding, of two people who had both found something they hadn't known they were looking for. They didn't need words. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, they were finally learning how to stay. The air had grown warmer, the days stretching into the fullness of summer. The work on the ranch was still as hard as it had always been, but Eliza had learned to embrace it. The rhythm of the land, the steady pull of the seasons, had a way of grounding her, filling the spaces inside her that had been empty for so long. She woke each morning to the sound of birds calling from the trees, the sun already creeping up over the horizon, casting long shadows across the earth. Caleb was already up, as always, tending to the animals or repairing something that needed fixing. His presence had become a constant in her life, steady and reliable, though still as quiet as the land itself. She had come to rely on that quiet. It was a comfort in a way she hadn't expected. The days passed slowly but surely, and as Eliza worked beside Caleb, something changed. The silence between them didn't feel so heavy anymore. They moved together in a rhythm, each step in sync with the other, as if they had been doing this for years. Caleb still didn't say much, but his actions spoke volumes. He didn't need to tell her what to do. He simply showed her. And in the evenings, when the work was done, they sat together on the porch, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the land. It wasn't love yet, but there was something between them now, something unspoken. Eliza felt it in the way Caleb's eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the small gestures that had become a part of their routine. It was a quiet thing, a steady thing, like the earth itself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb sat next to her on the porch. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the growing dusk. Eliza glanced over at him, noticing how the light played across his features, how the shadows made him look older, more tired, yet somehow more at peace. For a moment, she just watched him, taking in the silence. Caleb shifted beside her, his eyes turning to hers. "You ever wonder why we ended up here?" he asked, his voice low, almost lost in the night. Eliza blinked, surprised by the question. It wasn't something they had ever talked about. They had both come to this place with their own reasons, their own histories. She had never really asked Caleb why he had chosen this life, why he had left whatever it was behind him. But she had a feeling it was because he was running from something, just like she had. "I don't know," she replied, her voice soft. "I guess I never thought much about it. I just know that this feels like where I'm supposed to be." Caleb turned his gaze back to the horizon, his expression unreadable. "I never thought I'd end up here," he said quietly. "I thought I'd be somewhere else by now, doing something else." Eliza nodded, not sure what to say. She knew that feeling, the one where you think you'll be somewhere else, doing something different. But life, it seemed, had a way of pulling you in different directions, even when you thought you had it all figured out. "You don't have to leave, you know," Eliza said after a moment, her voice tentative but steady. Caleb looked at her, his eyes softening just a little. "I'm not planning on it," he replied, though there was something in his voice that made Eliza wonder if he meant it. There was still a part of him that seemed to be holding back, a part of him that hadn't fully let go of whatever it was that had brought him here in the first place. But she didn't push him. She knew better than to force someone to share their pain. Caleb hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought running would fix things, but all it did was make me run further away from who I am." Eliza felt the weight of his words settle between them. She knew that feeling too, the feeling of running, of leaving, thinking that somehow, distance would make everything better. But distance didn't heal anything. Time didn't fix what was broken. "You don't have to run anymore, Caleb," Eliza said quietly, her voice filled with something that wasn't just sympathy. It was understanding. "You're here now." Caleb's gaze held hers for a long moment, and for the first time, Eliza saw something like acceptance in his eyes. Maybe he had started to believe that staying, that facing the things he had been running from, wasn't as impossible as he had thought. They sat in silence for a while after that, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze. The world around them was quiet, as if it was waiting too. Eliza wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time since she had arrived, she felt like she might be exactly where she needed to be. The days stretched on, and Eliza found herself growing more comfortable in the quiet routine of ranch life. The land seemed to have a way of settling into her bones, the steady rise of the sun each morning and the slow fall of night over the fields. Caleb was always there, a constant, his movements as familiar as the wind that blew through the trees. It was hard to believe that, just a few months ago, she had been a stranger to this place, a woman lost and alone, unsure of where she was headed. Now, she felt rooted here, as though this land, this life, had always been part of her. Caleb remained as quiet as ever, but there was a shift in the way he moved around her. He didn't speak much, but there was something in his eyes when he looked at her, something she had never seen before. A softness, a trust. It was subtle, but it was there. And for the first time since she had arrived, Eliza felt like she was seeing the man behind the walls he had built around himself. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something else, something deeper, something that spoke of understanding, of two people who had both come to this place with their own scars, their own burdens, and were slowly, quietly learning how to heal together. One evening, after they had finished working, Caleb suggested they take a walk. It was an offer that surprised Eliza, but she didn't hesitate. They walked side by side in the soft evening light, the air cool and the stars beginning to appear in the sky above them. The land stretched out before them, empty and vast, but somehow, In the silence, it felt like they were not alone. As they walked, Caleb spoke for the first time in what felt like days. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. Eliza glanced over at him, unsure of what he meant. "About staying. About facing things." He paused, his hand brushing against hers. As they walked, it was a simple touch, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "But I'm not running anymore. Not from you. Not from this." Eliza felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest. She didn't know what it meant, not yet, but it was the first time Caleb had said anything that hinted at the possibility of something more between them. They stopped by the edge of the field, the long grass swaying gently in the breeze. The sound of the wind was the only thing that filled the silence between them now. Caleb looked out over the land, his expression distant, but there was something softer in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "I don't know if I'm ever going to have it all figured out," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I'm starting to think that maybe that's okay." Eliza nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never expected to hear those words from him, never thought that Caleb Boone, the man who had kept everyone at arm's length for so long, would open up like this. But here he was, sharing something with her that he had never shared with anyone before. "You don't have to have it all figured out," she said softly. "None of us do. We're just here, and that's enough." Caleb looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers with a tenderness that took her breath away. For a long moment, they stood there, the world around them quiet, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. And then, without a word, Caleb reached out, his hand finding hers. It was simple, the way their fingers intertwined, but it felt like something more than that. It felt like a promise, though neither of them had said it aloud. They stood there for a long time, watching the stars begin to fill the sky, the warmth of each other's presence settling around them like a blanket. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something that had been growing quietly, slowly, in the silence between them. And for the first time in a long while, Eliza felt like maybe, just maybe, this was where she was meant to be. The days continued to blend into one another, each one carrying with it a quiet sense of purpose. Caleb and Eliza had settled into a new rhythm, a silent understanding that grew with each passing day. The work never seemed to stop, but neither did the peace that had settled over their lives. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from running away from the past. It was the kind that came from facing it, slowly but surely, and learning how to live with it. One morning, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Eliza stood by the kitchen window, watching Caleb work in the field. He was bent over, his back straight, his movements as steady as always. There was something about the way he worked that intrigued her, the quiet intensity with which he approached everything. It was as if he didn't just work the land. He worked himself, chiseling away at something deep inside, something he had never allowed anyone to see. Eliza had spent so many years running from her own past, from her own pain, that she hadn't realized how much of herself she had kept hidden. But standing here now, watching Caleb, she realized that maybe there was a way to stop running. Maybe there was a way to face the things that had held them both captive for so long. She didn't know what it would look like, or how it would happen, but she knew that she couldn't keep hiding. Caleb was right. Staying was harder than leaving, but maybe, just maybe, it was the right thing to do. She turned away from the window and walked outside, the cool morning air brushing against her face. Caleb didn't notice her approach at first, his attention focused on the task at hand. But when she was close enough, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, his voice low but steady. "Morning," she replied, standing next to him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable, not awkward. Eliza glanced over at the work he was doing. "Need help?" she asked, her voice steady, but carrying a hint of something she hadn't fully realized before, an eagerness to be a part of whatever this was, to share in the work, the quiet, and the space they had created together. Caleb didn't immediately answer, his gaze shifting between her and the task before him. Finally, he nodded. "Could use a hand," he said simply, and Eliza stepped forward, ready to join him. As they worked side by side, Eliza felt something shift between them. It wasn't a grand gesture, no sudden outpouring of emotion, but there was a quiet sense of connection, a bond that had grown without either of them truly realizing it. They worked together, their movements in sync, their hands steady as they moved through the tasks at hand. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of silence, still times when words weren't necessary, but there was something there. Something unspoken, something that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she wasn't alone. Caleb didn't speak much, but his actions, the way he worked beside her, the small gestures of help he offered, spoke louder than words ever could. And Eliza, in her quiet way, offered the same in return. They didn't need to say it. They both knew. When the day began to fade into evening, and the work was done for the day, they stood together, side by side, looking out over the land. The sun was low in the sky, the horizon painted with the soft colors of twilight. For a moment, there was no need for words. The quiet, the stillness, it was enough. Eliza turned to Caleb, her heart a little fuller than it had been before. "You don't have to do this alone, Caleb," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything unsaid between them. Caleb's gaze softened, the lines of his face easing just a little. "I know," he said, his voice quiet, but steady. "But I'm starting to think maybe I don't have to anymore." And in that moment, Eliza knew that, for both of them, something had shifted. They weren't running anymore. They weren't hiding. They were here, together, on this land, and that was enough. The mornings had grown warmer, the air thick with the promise of summer. Caleb and Eliza had settled into a rhythm, each day flowing into the next like the steady pulse of the land itself. The work continued, of course, never ending, but the heaviness that had once clung to Eliza had begun to lift. The quiet peace between them had become something more. It wasn't love, not yet, at least, but it was something deeper. It was the comfort of knowing that they were no longer alone. In this life they had chosen. One evening, after finishing their work, Caleb stood at the edge of the field, looking out over the land, his arms folded across his chest. Eliza had watched him like this before, but tonight there was something different about him. He stood a little taller, as if the weight he had been carrying was finally starting to ease. She walked up beside him, standing in the soft glow of the setting sun, her gaze following his to the farthest horizon. They stood there in silence for a while, the world around them quiet and still. Eliza had learned to appreciate these moments, the ones where words weren't necessary. They had their own way of communicating, a silent understanding that had grown between them. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice low but steady. "I never thought I'd find this," he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the land in front of him. Eliza didn't need to ask what he meant. She knew. "I never thought I'd find peace," he continued, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I thought I had to leave it all behind, start fresh somewhere else. But I think I've been running in the wrong direction all along." Eliza looked at him, her heart tightening in her chest. She understood that feeling more than he could know. She had spent so many years running from everything, the pain, the memories, the loss. But here, with Caleb, she had learned something different. She had learned that sometimes running wasn't the answer. Sometimes it was about staying, facing what had happened, and finding a way to heal. She reached out then, her hand brushing against his arm. Caleb looked at her, surprised, but didn't pull away. For a moment, they simply stood there, the weight of everything they had both been through hanging in the air between them. "You don't have to keep running, Caleb," Eliza said softly. Her voice was steady, the words coming easier than she expected. "Neither of us does." Caleb's gaze softened then, his lips pressing into a thin line as he looked out at the land. For the first time in a long while, there was something in his eyes that Eliza could only describe as peace. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "Maybe not anymore." They stood together in silence, watching as the sun sank lower, the sky, turning shades of pink and orange. The evening air grew cooler, but the warmth between them lingered, a silent promise of something more. Eliza didn't know what the future held for them, but in that moment, she realized that it didn't matter. They had found something here, together, something that didn't need to be rushed or forced. It was enough, for now, to just be. They were no longer running, no longer hiding. They were here, on this land, learning how to live again. And that, Eliza thought, was a start, a new beginning, a quiet peace, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at something more. The days had grown warmer, and the work on the ranch felt like it was slowly becoming second nature to Eliza. The steady rhythm of the land, the early mornings and long evenings, had a way of calming her. There was something in the routine that made her feel grounded, as though she had finally found a place where she could just be. Caleb had become a steady presence in her life, his quiet nature blending seamlessly with her own. They worked together, side by side, each task a small piece of the puzzle they were both slowly putting together. He didn't need to speak much. His actions said enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Eliza was standing at the edge of the field, watching the sky change colors. The cool air had a bite to it, the promise of fall lingering just beneath the surface. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, taking in the stillness of the world around her. The barn loomed in the distance, the soft sound of Caleb's footsteps growing louder as he made his way toward her. He didn't speak at first, but there was something in the way he walked, a steadiness in his step that made Eliza feel like she wasn't so alone. They didn't need to fill every moment with words. They had both learned, over time, that sometimes silence said more than anything else. Caleb stopped beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, they simply stood there, watching as the first light of the day stretched across the land. "You ever think about what comes next?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the question itself might be too big for the quiet of the morning. Caleb's eyes shifted to her, his gaze softening just slightly. "I think about it," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "But I don't know. Some days, it feels like this is all I need." Eliza nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. There was something about Caleb, something in the way he approached life, that made her believe in the possibility of something more. They had both come to this place carrying their own burdens, their own pasts, but here, on this land, they were learning how to live again. "Maybe this is all we need," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the questions that still lingered in her mind. Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the field, his expression distant, as if he was weighing something in his mind. Eliza didn't press him, understanding that sometimes some things took time. After a few moments, he turned to her, his face softening. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice filled with a quiet honesty. "But I'm starting to think it doesn't have to be so hard." Eliza felt a wave of something, relief, perhaps, or hope, pass through her. For so long, she had lived in the shadows of her past, always running, always searching for something that felt real. But standing here with Caleb, on this land that had become their home, she realized that maybe this was it. Maybe this was what she had been looking for all along. She didn't have to have all the answers. They didn't have to have it all figured out. But here, together, they were finding something. Something that didn't require perfection, just the willingness to stay, to be present. As the morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, Eliza felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. This was enough. Maybe they would find more, maybe they wouldn't. But for now, they had this, each other, the land, and the quiet promise of a future that didn't require running anymore. The mornings had grown even warmer as the summer days stretched on. Eliza had gotten used to the early mornings, the cool air that always seemed to carry a promise of a fresh start. The work on the ranch had become second nature to her now, and it wasn't just the tasks she had come to appreciate. It was the life, the steadiness, the rhythm that had woven itself into her days, filling up the emptiness she had carried with her for so long. Caleb had become a steady presence in her life, a constant companion in this new chapter she had found. He didn't speak much, but that was how he was. His quiet nature had a way of drawing her in, making her feel like she wasn't alone, even in silence. They didn't need words. Their actions spoke for them, and with every task they completed together, the bond between them deepened. One morning, after they had finished working the land, Caleb motioned for Eliza to follow him. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over everything. She didn't ask where they were going. She trusted him, as she always had. They walked in silence, the soft crunch of their boots against the dirt the only sound that filled the air. Caleb led her to the edge of the field, where the view stretched out in front of them. The horizon seemed endless, and for the first time in a long while, Eliza felt a sense of peace settle deep in her chest. Caleb stopped and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. There was something in his gaze that made Eliza's heart skip a beat. It wasn't the same as before. There was more there now, something deeper. Something that said, without words, that maybe, just maybe, they were both starting to find the answers they had been looking for. You know, Caleb began, his voice low and steady. I never thought I'd be here. Never thought I'd find peace. But I think maybe, for the first time, I'm starting to understand what that really means. Eliza looked at him, her heart full as she realized that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't running anymore. And neither was he. The silence between them stretched out, comfortable and familiar, until Caleb took a step closer to her, his presence wrapping around her like a blanket. It's not perfect, he said, his voice softer now. But maybe it doesn't need to be. Eliza nodded slowly, her throat tight. She had never needed perfection. She had only needed this. This quiet, steady life they were building together. Caleb reached out, his hand brushing gently against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that, for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to know. She had found something here, something that wasn't about running or escaping, but about staying, about being present. Maybe this is enough, Eliza whispered, her words barely above a breath. Caleb didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, they were facing the future together. And that was enough. As they stood there, side by side, the world around them seemed to fall away. The land stretched out before them, endless and full of possibilities, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They were here, together, and that was enough. As the days grew warmer, Eliza found herself adjusting more to the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. The early mornings, the long hours spent working under the sun, the quiet evenings that seemed to stretch on forever. Each moment was slowly becoming familiar, like the land itself. Caleb remained as silent and steadfast as ever, but she had come to realize that his quietness was not something to be feared. It was a part of who he was, just as much as the land they worked. It didn't need to be fixed or changed. It was simply there, like a foundation that held them steady, even when the world around them seemed uncertain. They were different, yet they fit together, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be placed in their proper spots. One evening, after finishing the day's work, Eliza stood by the porch, looking out over the fields. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. Caleb was nearby, his back to her as he worked on securing the last of the fence posts. She could hear the soft sound of his movements, the rhythmic tapping of the hammer as he worked. There was something peaceful about it, the way he lost himself in the task, the way his focus never wavered. Eliza had come to admire that about him. He didn't need to rush, didn't feel the need to speak when silence was enough. She understood that now. As the light faded and the stars began to appear, she walked over to him. He glanced up when he heard her footsteps, offering a brief nod. There was a quiet understanding between them, something that didn't need words. Almost done? She asked, her voice soft in the stillness of the evening. Just about, Caleb replied, his tone as steady as always. Eliza watched him for a moment, the way his muscles moved as he worked, the quiet determination that seemed to define him. She had seen it before, but tonight, it felt different. There was a change in the air, something that spoke of possibility, of new beginnings. I was thinking, she began, her voice a little hesitant but steady. Maybe we could take a break tomorrow. Go into town, maybe. Caleb paused, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The silence between them was comfortable, but Eliza could feel a question hanging in the air. It was the same question she had asked herself over and over since she had arrived. What did the future hold for them? What did it look like, beyond the quiet work, the long days? Caleb set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his trousers, his gaze thoughtful. I think that sounds good, he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. It's been a while since I've been to town. Eliza smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't just the idea of going into town. It was the fact that Caleb had agreed to it, that he was open to something different, something beyond the quiet routine they had built. It was a small step, but it felt important. We could use a break, she said, her tone light. Caleb gave a small nod, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah, we could. As the night grew darker, they stood together, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves of the trees around them. Eliza felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet sense of contentment that she hadn't known she was searching for. This was it. This was what she had been looking for. Not grand gestures or promises of a perfect life, but this, quiet moments, steady work, and the knowledge that they were no longer running. No longer hiding from their pasts. They were here, together, and that, Eliza realized, was enough. The future was uncertain, as it always had been, but she no longer feared it. With Caleb by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. Together, they had found something real, something worth holding on to.